Good evening. I'm ecstatic to be here in the context of such an important event as this concert for the memorial to the enslavement of more than 12 million African people. You will see some clips from a film I made for the UNESCO Slave Route Project, and I've been doing research on Africa and the African diaspora for a very long time. And I was shocked at my ignorance when I began to work on this film. You won't see very much of it, there's not much time for that. But I just want to share with you a few of the things that I learned, and I like to think that this memorial, created in the context of the United Nations, will also be a memorial to knowledge, to information, to telling the truth, not just about the enslavement, of people from Africa, but of the significance of this enslavement to the creation of the entire Atlantic world and the entire modern world. Before getting to our heroes and sheroes, I want to say, just give you a sense of some of the basic facts that I learned about the Americas, because you can't talk about the Americas, you can't talk about the Atlantic world without talking about the role of the enslavement of Africans during almost 4 centuries, during the 5 centuries of the existence of the Americas, the modern Americas. First of all, demographics of the Americas. Now this really shocked me. When I learned, and I realized that until I learned a few years ago, I was so ignorant of this, until 1800, of 6,500,000 people who came across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe and Africa, 1 million came from Europe. 5.5 million came from Africa. So during the majority of the history of the Americas, the modern Americas, almost everybody was African and African descendant. How then can you talk about the story of the Americas without talking about the majority of the people who built the Americas? I have to say a little something about the economics. Africans were brought to work. Africans were brought to enrich the people who bought and sold them, who enslaved them for hundreds of years. And when these Africans were freed, who received indemnizations? In Washington recently, at the celebration of abolition of slavery in Washington, there was a word I hadn't heard before: compensated emancipation. Who was compensated? It was not the descendants of the people who had worked. It was the people who had owned them who were compensated for the loss of their human property. Not just in Washington. This is Atlantic. All right, economics. The products produced for free by these millions of Africans were what fueled the Industrial Revolution that's the basis of the inequality of the nations of the world right now, the basis of the underdeveloping of Africa. I think this is really important. It's just basic facts to understand where we are now. Culture. I think it's very important to acknowledge the contributions of Africans to the cultures of the Americas, the music, dance, spirituality, language, foods. But what about the technology? What about the transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas? The agriculture, the gold. Africans were brought specifically because of their technological knowledge to mine gold in the Americas. Every place where there was gold, there were Africans. And some of the first revolts were in places where there was gold, in Buria, in Venezuela in the 1500s, in San Pedro Sula, in Honduras in the 1500s. But this is a huge story. There is no place where Africans were not fighting against being enslaved, and once they were enslaved, they were fighting to get out of being enslaved. In Africa, Africans didn't just passively accept being enslaved. Europeans had weapons of mass destruction these Africans didn't have. But Africans' whole populations moved away, created houses that are fortresses until today. People who live in inaccessible areas. In Benin, there's a whole population who lives in the middle of a lagoon because the people who were preying on them to enslave them did not have the ability or the belief that they could cross water. So these people still live in the middle of a lagoon to escape from enslavement. Slave ships, we were told we couldn't know much. Now we know we can know a whole lot. There are at least 35,000 documented trips of slave ships. And Africans, one of the justifications is that Africans were passive. Well, if Africans were passive, why were there documented 10% of those slave ships, of the 35,000, on 10% of them, there were revolts by these Africans in chains on boats in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This should be basic knowledge at this point if we're going to say we know anything about the Atlantic world. Now, I want to say a little something about places where Africans revolted specifically. First of all, let me mention, and these are Africans with names. These are not generic Africans. In Ecuador, in the 1500s, there was a shipwreck in Esmeraldas. Alonso de Illescas became the leader of a group of Africans and indigenous people. The queen wanted to name him governor of the province of Esmeraldas, and his response was, "Why should I be governor for you? I am the king here." And that was the end of the discussion. Ecuador, Pacific coast of South America. How many of us think about Ecuador when we think of Afro-descendants in the Americas? Colombia, Bencos Biojo, created the Palenque de San Basilio on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. It is still there. There are still descendants of enslaved people who didn't like it and walked away, who fought against their enslavers, who created a language. It's there. You can visit it. I did. Mexico, you can go to Yanga. Yanga fought against the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown created a treaty with Yanga. Please stop fighting with us. You can go to Yanga. It's near Veracruz on the Caribbean coast of Mexico. So I think when we think about Africans in the Americas, first of all, we always need to think about what went on between Chile and Canada, because there were African descendants in all of those places. And none of them accepted, in none of those places did all enslaved people accept being enslaved passively. Brazil, which is the second largest African country in the world, after Nigeria, in the 1600s, for 100 years, the Quilombo of Palmares was a free place in Brazil. Brazil was a colony of Portugal. The people in Palmares fought off the Dutch and the Portuguese over and over and over for almost 100 years. The leader was Zumbi, okay? Let me talk about Panama. We don't talk about Panama very much when we think about enslaved Africans, but in the 1500s, there were several maroon communities led by people whose arc was not from slavery to freedom, as John Hope Franklin's book tells us, but from freedom to freedom. These were enslaved people who arrived in the Americas and said, "Oh, no way, I'm not accepting this." And so there are records of revolts, 1500s, maroon communities led by people whose names indicate where they came from in Africa. Luis de Mozambique, Anton Mandinga, Diego Congo. These people kept their identity, their African identity, and fought. And since this event was, and since it is Jamaica that is spearheading this memorial to the memory of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade and of Africans enslaved in the Americas, I would like to end in talking about resistors with a woman, Nanny. Nanny. Thank you very much.
Africans resisted first within Africa. In Angola, Queen Nzinga fought a more than 30-year war against Portuguese slave traders until they negotiated a treaty with her in 1656. However, some kings agreed to trade with the Europeans and took personal benefit from the slave trade by strengthening their power with imported firearms. Other Africans, refusing to be captured and sold to enslavers, resisted and ran away to places hard of access, like the Tofinu people in Benin, who built their villages in the middle of lagoons.
Segundo, uma resistência nos portos de embarque. Então não é à toa que os armazéns e as feitorias eram prisões. Durante a viagem havia várias rebeliões e nós temos notícias de vários navios que foram recuperados pelos escravos, onde o caso hoje mais comum o caso que foi objeto de um filme chamado Amistade, e por fim revoltas dos lugares de trabalho onde eles eram inseridos.
And this continued in the Americas when people found themselves in inhospitable milieus who were defined by those who owned them as property. And these people refused to accept that definition of themselves. If they had accepted it, then they would not have challenged the forces of oppression. But they began as early as 1522 in Santo Domingo. And there was an avalanche of rebellions throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in Jamaica, in Mexico, in Cuba, in Brazil and Venezuela, all over the diaspora, in the United States or North America for that matter. But this kind of physical challenge to slavery was not restricted to rebellions. People ran away, escaped into inaccessible parts of these countries and established free settlements. The Maroons in Jamaica, for example, signed a peace treaty with the British in 1739 that recognized their freedom.
Yanga, que era de origen noble, se subió a las montañas de Orizaba y constituyó un palenque. Y tuvo varios de sus compañeros de lucha que encabezaron una resistencia armada, combatieron las fuerzas coloniales durante casi 40 años. Finalmente pactaron el virrey y Yanga la fundación de San Lorenzo de los Negros, que es el actual municipio de Yanga.
Now, the Haitian Revolution, of course, is the most spectacular of the challenges to slavery. The only society in this hemisphere that was able to overthrow slavery by violent means. Of course, after that, they had to confront all kinds of efforts to nullify their freedom because Europeans became afraid that what happened in Haiti could happen in their backyard.
Haiti became the world's first black republic and the first republic in the Americas to abolish slavery. Haiti also successfully supported wars of independence led by Simón Bolívar in Latin America by providing strategic information, funds, and troops against Spanish colonialism. The quest for freedom by enslaved people began to be supported by increasingly influential groups of ordinary people in Europe and the Americas, as they learned from former victims about the horrors of the system that was developing their nations, enriching their lives, and forging their tastes. More and more leaders of abolitionist movements, such as William Wilberforce in England, Victor Schœlcher in France, and Frederick Douglass in the United States, campaigned to put an end to slavery.